every video game has to stand on the shoulders of those who came before. Every platformer has to have something that differentiates it from Mario. Every strategy game needs to be the new Civilization. The constant rat race of creating an interesting video game is staying ahead of the been there, done that experience of gamers who are constantly wanting to play the next big thing. If a development studio can make that next big thing, then that means they've built up the potential for a massive, successful franchise, as long as they can ride the wave and stay ahead of the market. The first Halo game was the beginning of that wave, and Halo 2 was an unexpected growth in the franchise in terms of lore, gameplay, aesthetics, and user experience. Not to mention that this was the first Halo game to involve true online matchmaking through Xbox Live. I went into this game expecting more of the same, and while nearly every aspect of the gameplay in Halo 2 was recognizable, the way that Bungie Studios deepened the familiar Halo experience into an exceptional sequel blew me out of the water and made me love this series even more. Let's figure out how they could have possibly improved on such a classic as we uncover what's so great about Halo 2. Halo 2 begins its campaign with an interesting contrast of a celebration and a punishment, both in response to the events of the first Halo game. Master Chief and Sergeant Johnson are recognized for their valiant efforts to destroy the Halo that threatened life in the universe, while at the same time, far away in Covenant territory, a nameless elite is stripped of his armor and crucified, seemingly for letting Master Chief get away. It's pretty interesting that they want us to feel bad about a random elite from the moment this game begins, especially considering we did nothing but slaughter dozens and dozens of their kind in the previous game, but we'll get more into that later. On the human side of this dichotomous opening, we meet Commander Keyes' daughter Miranda and Fleet Admiral Hood, both of whom will remain significant parts of the Halo storyline. On the Covenant side, we're actually seeing the elites speaking English, or rather members of the Covenant from multiple races and species all speaking it. While the grunt units had some infrequent comments in English during the first Halo game, the elites were known for their goofy sounding backwards talk. Now we're actually given an opportunity to understand a bit more about this race as we learn more about individual goals, plights, and ideations that stem from the enemy side of the war. This opening also helps to establish the fact that the Covenant is not actually a specific race of aliens, but rather the name of something more along the lines of a military faction or religious order, as it is a blend of soldiers and religion-fueled leaders that all come from the various species of aliens, including elites, jackals, this game's new main antagonists, the Brutes, and a few other contributors. Once the gameplay gets started, we're back in the pilot seat with Master Chief as he gets his suit tested and calibrated once more. You're shown the fact that your new heads-up display and other features and changes in gameplay are due to the upgrade in Master Chief's armor from Mark V to Mark VI. Your energy shields recharge faster now, but you also no longer have a visible health bar. At first I was wondering why this would be, as it definitely makes complex combat scenarios a bit more difficult, but then I realized it actually kind of makes sense that your suit would be able to measure how much remaining shield you have, but not how close to death you were. If your suit no longer has a shield, your first reflex should be to get behind cover until it regenerates, not just see if you've got enough life left in you to fight another enemy. Of course, with this being a science fiction action franchise, one style of gameplay that was notably missing from the first entry in the series would have been space battles, as in actual soldier versus soldier combat in space, and this time around, we get some of that right off the bat with the attack on Cairo Station. Segments outside of the airlock are affected with lower gravity and a reduction in noise, and while this style of gameplay has certainly been played out in some form across numerous video games, it's still a fun change of pace as long as it doesn't outstay its welcome. And in Halo 2, it certainly doesn't, as you're out and back in before you know it, and the inclusion of these brief outer space segments still solidify the user's experience in thinking subconsciously about where they are and what's going on. Just as I applauded the artificial intelligence in the first Halo game, the same quality is returned with some fun new aspects, notably with the involvement of vehicles. If you get out of the driver's seat of a vehicle, your passenger will take over to avoid sitting in enemy fire. There's also a section pretty early on in which you will be the gunner and your ally will drive the Warthog for you. At first I thought that the AI on this driving section was pretty impressive, with how much it felt like another player was in charge and that I wasn't just taken for a ride in some on-rails shooter segment. Then I realized that allowing a teammate to drive isn't even a scripted event, as with that first instance of Master Chief and Sergeant Johnson. If you feel like being the gunner and you have an ally close by, they'll take you for a spin and let you shred the enemies with the Warthog's minigun. In fact, they may even stop at certain spots to give you a specific view with accompanying dialogue.
Whoa. It's like a postcard. Dear Sarge, kicking ass in outer space, wish you were here.
I heard that, jackass!
This felt a little odd when it first happened, as it was neither a cutscene nor incredibly important information, but it was a fun little optional experience to be had that just felt like one of those little bonus sections of a game that many people may have missed out on, but you got to experience as it further characterized both your allies and the world around you. They're not the greatest drivers in the world, but considering they know that it's probably wise to drive away from incoming missiles, I'd say that's more than to be expected from non-playable characters in 2004. This entry in the Halo franchise had some big changes to which weapons were available to you, how many weapon options existed in the world, as well as how they all worked in the broad scheme of things. From the game's cover art alone, we see the introduction of submachine guns, as well as the ability to dual-wield smaller firearms. In fact, they don't even have to be two of the same kind of weapon, creating interesting possibilities for the chance to wield weapons that do both ballistic and energy damage. Since these new submachine guns and other freshly introduced weapons like the battle rifle are more of a minimalistic military design, they don't have the same science fiction features of many of the weapons in the first game that allowed you to keep track of your ammo without referring to the number in the corner of the screen. So now, for many of these weapons, the ammunition count in the corner has become an integral part of weapon management, as it shows different measurements for your weapons based on remaining bullets or energy. This is especially necessary for the new feature of dual wielding, since guns can be reloaded or recharged individually while you fire with your other hand. As great as firing two weapons at once sounds, there are also some fair and reasonable drawbacks, like which guns you're able to dual wield, as well as the fact that you can't melee or throw grenades with your hands full. The humans aren't the only side of the war to see an improvement in their armory, but to really understand why that's a bigger deal, let's dig into possibly the most notable sections of this sequel's experience, which would be the Arbiter gameplay. Remember that elite that we're supposed to feel bad for at the beginning of the game? Well, for a portion of Halo 2, a few missions after the game begins, you'll actually get to play as him as he attempts to redeem himself in the eyes of the Covenant. This section of gameplay grew on me more and more as I experienced it, and helped me unravel what made this game and the Halo franchise as a whole so spectacular. The Arbiter sections of Halo 2 feel like they draw inspiration from the Doom franchise and other early shooters, due to being forced to use Halo sci-fi weaponry that you'd typically be avoiding if you had enough teammates dropping resources in your missions as Master Chief. This also nudges the player towards discovering how these enemy guns work, as well as which ones are new to this sequel in case you played plenty of Halo Combat Evolved over the years. There are also some new great ones with two new kinds of high precision rifles, one using charge and one bullets, and a minigun equivalent known as the Sentinel Beam, as well as the energy sword that was unavailable to use as an enemy pickup in the first Halo game. The chapters you play as the Arbiter also feel closer to the ground and more claustrophobic, with fewer open-air locations and not as much necessity to jump or use large vehicles. This also plays into his primary weapon of the energy sword, which, if you're playing on lower difficulties at least, gives you an extreme sense of zealous power as you slash through rebellious Covenant forces. At first, it felt a little weird to be shooting at certain Covenant soldiers and not others, but this momentary uncertainty definitely helped in constructing the sensation that the Covenant is splintering, and there's plenty of chaos abound in the side of the war that we don't often get to experience as the Master Chief. We'll also get to experience some very different styles of gameplay, even if only for short moments, while fighting for the Covenant side, such as Banshee dogfights in huge open spaces. The flying section feels as powerful as one of those levels in a shooter game where you're just the gunner in an attack helicopter or something, but you also have the interesting maneuverability of the Banshee to take into account. This airborne level also isn't just a freebie for you to plow through. You have to keep an eye on the condition of your Banshee and steal another enemy's vehicle if things are getting rough. Now, before we stray too far from discussing the game's combat, here's the weirdo twist surrounding the weapons in the Halo series. The guns that are less intuitive to you as a human being, essentially the guns that aren't just point where you want to send bullets, are actually a lot more useful than would be anticipated by them just being guns off of the floor, which in most video game shooters would be the less effective guns. However, in this instance, it makes a lot of sense, and it's another aspect of Halo's design that should be applauded for contributing even more to this video game universe, and for leaving information for the player to discover that doesn't need to be broadcast on the back of the box. What I'm talking about here is the fact that, of course, the Covenant weapons would be effective against Covenant soldiers. After all, Human weapons are designed to be effective on human soldiers, so each species in this game is putting into practice the tools of warfare that they find the most useful. Humans want bullets to be more useful against the same flesh and bone that their soldiers are made of. At the same time, the Covenant perceive energy shields to be the superior form of defense. So, why shouldn't their weapons be designed with that interpretation in mind when preparing for militaristic threats? Putting all of this thought into action allows the player to prepare for their conflicts with the advantages and disadvantages of all weapon types in play. Now let's get to talking about the greatest enemy in the Halo series, no matter which side you're fighting for, and that would be the Flood. The developers of Halo 2 did a good job in portraying the return of the Flood like a horror movie, where you can see and hear the creatures on the other side of the wall but don't get a good look at them as they attack other NPCs. The Flood creatures were given far more vocalizations this time, which are very zombie-like. And while that feels like the easiest choice for the developers to make, it does still add a certain daunting atmosphere to hear those unthinking groans growing in either volume or number. The carrier units of the Flood populace are certainly more gross and disturbing, and thanks to advancements in how other Flood units operate, these pulsating zombie-like characters may wind up being some of your most significant obstacles in dire situations. The Flood larvae, or pod infectors that burst from these units, can actually burrow into the chest of a fallen enemy and reanimate it. Discovering this possibility immediately makes these enemies much more terrifying, pressing the player into a sensation of frantic paranoia as they just try to eliminate these dangerous pests before they can scramble to a new host. It really gets the point across that this is a parasitic species intent on consuming all other life. Even while you're not playing as a human, that point is still very well conveyed. The Flood is truly the greatest threat to the universe, and despite everything else going on around you, it almost becomes more imperative to kill the Flood units than the people shooting at you. The differences in ballistic damage versus energy damage that we talked about earlier is equally as important to know when dealing with the Flood, and the idea of bullets for humans and plasma for Covenant carries over to whichever host the Flood consumed. You can also tell that the transformed Flood hosts are simply being controlled by the parasite, because it seems their most preferred method of attack is still direct combat by swinging their arms at you, just like the smaller Flood drones will do while trying to leech onto their prey. The abducted hosts that were carrying guns, however, will still hold on to them, but the Flood-controlled soldiers will have poor aim as the parasites have no idea how these weapons work. If their firearms are knocked out of their hands during combat, these zombie-like creatures will revert to leaping and swiping at you as you fight off hordes of this terrifying parasite. This is one of the most interesting direct sequels I've ever played, due in no insignificant part to what it did for the advancement of the franchise. The way we look at enemies became a lot more interesting as we advanced a little further along from the idea of human good, alien bad. With the completion of this game's campaign, the player's understanding of the world of Halo becomes much broader, in roughly the same time they spent playing the campaign of the first entry in the series. Halo 2 is a great example of what a Part 2 in a trilogy should be, because after you've played enough of the game, it becomes clear that new elements are being introduced for the already planned third entry, as a game that's simply a sequel with no trilogy planned would have a very different feeling. But Halo 2 fills its role as the second entry out of 3 perfectly by improving upon the enjoyable gameplay mechanics of its predecessor, expanding the lore of the universe to construct more fleshed out characters and conflicts, and finally, acting as a solid stepping stone in the story, creating equal amounts of questions and answers to surface for the player as we build anticipation for the next chapter of Master Chief's Odyssey. That is what's so great about Halo 2. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we expanded our knowledge of Halo 2. Make sure to tell us what you think about Halo 2, or even suggest a game for another video. If you want to help in supporting the channel, or maybe check out some bonus content, consider checking out our Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. Links to all of those are in the description. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Sonic the Hedgehog, on screen or in the description. And please take the time to subscribe to be involved in the discussions here. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.